Hello again, everyone. It's good to be with you again on Thursday. And I want to finish my discussions on Revelation this Thursday. Again, we're working through the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, and the last chapter deals with the writing of Revelation. Now, I've approached this from apocalyptic style of writing and explaining that style of writing, and the book does also. I'm bringing out some more things that would be very helpful for you as you read through these styles of writing. So again, today will be my last segment on the writing of Revelation or apocalyptic style of writing. And I want to talk about the structure of Revelation and its repetitive nature, and how this will help you in understanding what is going on in Revelation itself. Now, real quickly about the structure of Revelation. So, in chapter 1, we have important information presented right off the bat. I've been talking to you about this as introductory information. It is seminal for what will be coming later. In fact, chapter 1 introduces many of the major ideas that will carry through throughout Revelation. Ideas like God's authority, Christ's concern for his church, John as the witness to this and the one who is sharing this message with the other Christians. So these carry through in the rest of Revelation for sure. Chapters 2 and 3, which are really odd, why John does this is odd, but there's addresses to 7 churches. Now, I do think they're just 7 strict churches. I mean, number 7, I don't think there's anything symbolic going on here. And there are words of encouragement to some of these churches. There are also words of warning. And as I said, I believe last week, is that in these addresses to these churches, there are symbols and images presented, an apocalyptic style in some sense. Not what I have talked about being full-blown, but there are apocalyptic elements within these letters themselves. Now, in chapter 4, things begin to change. They change dramatically from chapters 4 through 22. So this is where I'm going to be talking about the repetitive nature of Revelation and how to read this portion of Revelation. So it's kind of odd the way that Revelation is set up, because chapters 2 and 3 kind of interrupt the whole process. However, they are very important in that the churches need to know what is coming and that God has not forgotten them and that God's justice is coming. Now, real quickly, when you're reading through Revelation, in fact, this is a principle you should use for any biblical book that you are reading through. You need to read that whole writing in one setting. Now, Revelation is 22 chapters. I think reasonably you could read through it carefully in 2 hours' time. Most of us have 2 hours in the evening to sit down and read through this writing. And if you read through it in one setting like that, you're going to begin to notice that there are phrases that repeat throughout Revelation. In fact, one of the phrases that repeats is, "He will wipe away their tears." It's repeated twice in Revelation. The idea of Jesus coming back as a thief in the night is repeated in Revelation. And so, many images, for instance, God depicted as in his glory and authority, this kind of image is repeated throughout Revelation. It's told in a different way with different words or different word pictures, but still we have the idea of God's glory and authority being presented throughout Revelation. So Revelation is highly repetitive. In fact, in chapters 4 through 22, there are 5 cycles. What I mean by a cycle is there's a set of data that's given to the audience, and it comes to a conclusion. And then the similar idea is presented again in a different way. So it's the second cycle, and it continues to do this through 5 cycles. So John gives information, the same information, really, just 5 different ways. Now, real quickly, again, I'm dealing from chapters 4 through 22. Now, some people would expand this cycle structure that I'm talking about in Revelation to 7, and they would include chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then they would split up parts of chapters 21 and 22, or 20, 21, and 22. They split some of that up again in order to get 7. I think 7 is, they just think it's supposed to be a symbolic, since Revelation is apocalyptic, they're looking for some kind of symbolic linkage there. I just don't really think it's there. I think there we have 5, and I'm going to start in chapter 4. So chapter 4 all the way through 22, we have these 5 cycles. Now let me tell you the length of each cycle. So the first cycle, cycle 1, runs from chapter 4 all the way up to chapter 7, to the end of chapter 7. So that's cycle 1, from chapter 4 through chapter 7. Cycle 2 picks up in chapter 8, and it runs all the way to the end of chapter 11. And then we have cycle 3. Cycle 3 starts in chapter 12 and runs through chapter 15. Then you have cycle 4. It runs from chapter 16 through chapter 19. And then the last cycle is cycle 5, chapter 20 through chapter 22. These are the cycles in Revelation. Again, these cycles say the same thing. This information, this data set that I'm going to give you, they say the same thing except in a different way each time. Now, each of these cycles, real quickly before I begin to explain them, what you begin to notice as you start to read closely through Revelation is that these recurring phrases really are signals of different cycles. So there's different things being presented in different ways, or I should say the same thing, the same things being presented in different ways is what's going on. One of the things that's so interesting about these cycles, and what really tipped me off about this before I really started looking at some other scholars' work, in fact, many scholars most scholars understand this as being a cyclic type of writing. It's not anything new out there about this. In fact, this is really old information. Now, one of the things I started picking up on when I was reading through, studying through Revelation many years ago, is that there seemed to be this recurring image of a catastrophic end of time finality. And it was repeated over and over and over. So you have the image of, flashes of lightning and peals of thunder and great hailstones and the angels going out and reaping the fields and the blood that is associated with Christ's return and so many other things. That we have this catastrophic end of time finality imagery, and the judgment is associated with this kind of imagery also. So this repeats itself over and over and over. And that's the first thing that I noticed. And then I began to see other things were also being repetitive throughout Revelation. For instance, I noticed the idea of God's glory and dominion was repeated throughout Revelation in different ways, but it's always there. Another interesting thing about these cycles, and I bring this out when I'm talking about the cycle, the data within a cycle itself. One of the interesting things about the way that Revelation has been written is that John, when he's dealing in a cycle, he'll give preference to one of the details, one set of detailed information over other sets. So for instance, as I'm walking through this information, I'll talk about how some of this type of information is expressed more emphatically in this cycle, and I'll tell you why. But for some reason, he gives different details and different amounts of information about certain parts of the cycle dispersed throughout different cycles itself. So, here's a cycle structure. Generally what happens in a cycle. What you have is you have God's glory and authority being presented. That happens. So, chapters 4 and 5 of Revelation are a wonderful depiction of this. Now, chapter 15 also echoes this, but it's not nearly as glamorous and as awesome as what goes on in chapters 4 and 5. So, we have right at the beginning, and I think it's probably designed this way. I think it's very powerful way to speak to people, especially if you're trying to encourage them to stay faithful to God, is that God is the ultimate authority. That's it. Now, the Roman emperor thought they had authority, and yes, we need to talk about that a little bit, about government structures. They had authority, but they don't have authority outside of their empire itself. So even the Roman Empire, if you say it had authority, it only has it within its confines of its boundaries. That's it. So in the east, where it's fighting the Parthian Empire, you cross that border, guess what? Rome no longer has authority in the Parthian Empire. You go north into the Germanic tribes, guess what? Rome no longer has authority in those areas because it's outside of their boundaries. So my point is that no matter what you think about authority, Rome's authority is limited. Whereas God's authority in chapter 4 and then Christ's authority in chapter 5, their authority is unlimited and it is overarching. So God is more powerful than the Roman Empire. Now, I'm sure people in the Roman Empire and the emperor himself probably thought differently, but regardless, God is expressing himself as being the ultimate authority. Now, real quickly, about government and Christianity. There's a big change that happens in the New Testament as far as the way Christians are supposed to be interacting with the government. Romans 13, 1 through 7 is very, very clear. Now, this is all prior to what's going on in Revelation, so we've got to understand the timeline. Romans is written in 55. We'll say 55 to 57, somewhere around there. And in Romans 13, 1 through 7, Paul is very clear. We are to submit to the governing authorities, and these authorities are actually, he calls them a diakonos, or a minister, or the word we get deacon from, of God's justice, in a sense. Now, it doesn't say that God is working through government. It just says Christians need to submit to government. At that time, it was a king or an emperor. So God's not really worried about what type of government it is or anything else. Romans 13, we are to submit and that understand that God has directed this. And I think what it is he's directed humanity. Within humanity, there is a innate desire to have order for most people. And this is the way that we structure our civilization. 1 Peter chapter 2, 13 through 17, this is even more direct about being submissive. Submit to the king is what it says, to the emperor, and honor that person. And so Christians are never called to be combative. We are called to be submissive. In fact, the idea that I really think is what Paul and Peter are getting at is that, you know, the church itself has to live within this environment. You're living within the Roman Empire. So do what it is you need to do to placate them so that you can do what you're really supposed to do. And that is share the message of good news about Jesus Christ to those people who need to hear it, those people who have not heard it. And so we're to be mission-oriented, not government-oriented. We got off track a long time ago on that, back in the 1980s. Now, there's something very unique that happens in Revelation. So in Revelation 13 and 14, government is depicted as beastly. In fact, we'll talk about this more, why he uses the beast imagery. But we definitely have in those chapters is that Christianity can no longer be submissive to the Roman government when, now this is the key, when the Roman government wants to instill some form of imperial worship upon the church, meaning that they have to worship the Roman emperor as a god also. That's a problem. That's when Christians can no longer be submissive. At that point, just at that point, we don't give our allegiance to anything but God. That's what we do. That's what Revelation 13, 14 tells us. We live in this world, but we're not a part of this world. Our allegiance only goes to God. And when the government asks us to do something like that, bow down to them, recognize them as being divine or whatever else, messianic, I don't know, some crazy idea. I'm sure there's more crazy ideas out there. Is that we cannot abide. So when it gets to that point, we can no longer be submissive in that regard, and we have to pull away. And we have to be willing to accept punishment or whatever else the government will levy against us. We just cannot give lordship to anyone else or anything else except to Christ. And that is it. Period. Now, again, the Christians needed to hear that God is in authority. Rome thought they were in authority. Rome was going to try to push Christians around. Well, they will push Christians around. They have pushed Christians around. And they will try to get them to do this, worshiping the emperor as a god, which is not something they should be doing. In fact, this is depicted in chapter 14 of Revelation itself. First, real quickly about 1 Peter 2, written probably around 25 years, 30 years before Revelation, but we still have this idea going on. But something has happened after the writing of 1 Peter. In fact, in 1 Peter itself, we do have what I think is the initial perspective about persecution that is afflicting the church. It seems to increase. By the time we get to Revelation, it's gotten to be a lot worse. Let's put it that way. So in the first cycle, God's authority and dominion is stressed, and also his power. So that information is stressed in cycle 1 for some reason. Now cycle 2. Cycle 2 begins in chapter 8 and goes all the way through chapter 11. Now in cycle 2 reveals the significance of God's people's pleas. So chapter 8 is really interesting. The very first part, chapter 8, 1 through 4, where God's people are crying out to God for justice. They're praying, and we have this view presented to us that everything in heaven stops, or there's great silence. And it says for 30 minutes. I don't know if there's anything significant about 30 minutes, just for the fact that it's longer than a moment. Let's put it that way. Now, God's outside of time, so I don't know how you can put a time, some kind of a time measurement upon God himself, but we still have this imagery, and this is what John gives us. But the point of the matter is that God's people are being oppressed. They're facing difficulties. They cry out to God. God gives them his direct focus. He focuses nowhere else except upon them. So he gives them their direct attention. This is what goes on in cycle 2. Also in cycle 2, we find out that God's people are protected. They're protected. And so what's going on is not going to damage, hurt anything God's people. It's only wicked people and unfaithful people who are going to experience these difficulties. So I assume there are some people in that day, just like there are today, that would claim to be Christian, but their life is nothing that doesn't mirror any kind of Christian behavior. And so I consider them to be unfaithful. Those kind of people, also along with the wicked, will have to answer. But God's people, faithful people, are protected through the entire event. Cycle 3. Cycle 3 begins in chapter 15 and carries through until the end of... Chapter 3 starts in Cycle 3 starts in chapter 12 and goes through 15. So in chapter... Excuse me, I keep getting chapter and cycle mixed up. In cycle 3, starts in chapter 12 and goes through chapter 15. In this cycle, we have more information presented to us about the oppressive forces directed against Christianity. We find out at this point that it's Satan who's directly attacking the church, and he's using secular forces in order to try to achieve his goal. So we have more information presented to us about the oppressive nature and the oppressive forces against the church or God's people at this time. Cycle 4 begins in chapter 16, goes through chapter 19. Cycle 4 is very interesting because we have a new topic that comes up. It's first introduced in the Church of Laodicea, and it's the idea of seduction. This comes out very clearly in chapters 18 and part of 19, and chapter 17 too, 17, 18, and into 19, that God's people, some of them are being seduced. And it shows the power of seductive forces arrayed against Christianity, and it's affecting people. Now these seductive forces we have the idea of merchants and ship captains and leading people of society, that kind of idea. It's talking about wealth, money, and influence, things that people want in order to have a better circumstance, I guess, within this world that they live in itself. But cycle 4 definitely shows us that the seductive powers are just as dangerous, and I even think more so, than the forces of persecution. So we have two oppressive forces directed against Christianity. One's persecution and the other is seduction. And the idea of seduction comes out clearly, lucidly in cycle 4. Cycle 5 runs through chapter 20 through chapter 22. And in cycle 5, we see the fullness of God's judgment directed against wickedness. And so this is the finality. And so we have this judgment type of scenery all the way through, but in chapters 20 through 22, we have the details of this event. We are given more details, let's put it that way, than we are in other cycles. And not only do we see that God's judgment is directed against wickedness, but we also find out that God's people who have stayed true and faithful to Him will have their everlasting commune with God Himself. And so God's people will be with God forever. Now, some of you may be wondering, I just want to take up a few more of your minutes, and that's about it. I've talked more than enough about Revelation. Some of you might ask, why is there a need for cycles in Revelation? Well, one of the best teaching methods that has ever been produced is repetitive instruction. So we have these repetitive ideas carrying through. Now again, John never uses, sometimes he uses the same wording. It's not abundant, it's very, very sparse. He'll use similar wording, but most of the time it's similar imagery. Or if you're looking at the construction of some kind of a picture that he's trying to draw with these words that he's assembling, you will see synonymous imagery in other areas or in other cycles. That's the point. It's the same idea. It's just presented in a different way. And this repetition reinforces to people. Reinforces. Now, again, remember this too. The people then they can't read. Most of them cannot read and write. In fact, there's probably some people who could read and not write, but most people are completely illiterate. So the only thing they could do as far as receiving information is to hear it. So repetition when you're hearing is a very good way to implant information into a person. You just continually repeat it, and if you can repeat it in a different way, and they come to the conclusions that you're wanting to, that you've drawn, that are synonymous with others, it's even going to reinforce this more so as they continue to work through or listen to the message of Revelation itself. Now, why would you use different images, have this repetitive nature, and continue to project the same view? Meaning he's using different words, he's assembling these words in different ways to give us pictures, and we have a picture of what's going on, but the pictures are a little different. But the messaging of what transpires is the same, okay? Why would John do that? Well, it keeps it interesting. If you were to hear the exact same thing over and over and over, same words, same images being projected over and over and over for 5 times, you are going to be completely bored and you're going to tune all this information out. But if I can insert repetition in a way that makes you have to think about the process, uses different wording, different imageries, so forth and so on, it will keep you interested. And that's what its point is. So let me close up this way. Revelation is repetitive. There are 5 cycles. So as you read through the entirety of Revelation, start thinking about this. Are there any recurring phrases that occur? Write them down, jot them down. Are these images, do they closely resemble other images and what those images are trying to project? Write all that stuff down, and you'll find that these repetitive phrasings and imageries are all over Revelation as John works through these cycles of this information. Now, within the cycle itself, again, there's certain pieces of information that will always be there. God's authority, God's people crying out for justice, God enacting justice, some kind of judgment upon wickedness, and then some kind of a reward for God's people and their faithfulness. So this goes over and over, and again, it cycles through Revelation from chapters 4 through 22 5 times. Now, Revelation reveals to us also that wickedness will come to an end. It is coming to an end, and that God's covenant community, His church, will continue or to have everlasting life. I hope this helps you in your reading of Revelation. If you have more questions, you can contact me about it or talk to me at church sometime if you want to. this will close up what we're going to do on Revelation. And next week, the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, this is the 3rd edition. And the 4th edition shouldn't be much different. But what I want to do next week is I actually want to look at chapter 12. I want to talk about wisdom literature before we start talking about some of the other literatures, because wisdom literature is probably something that you don't really think a lot about, and so it might be something that might be interesting to you. So we'll deal with chapter 12 next week and talk about wisdom literature. Hope you all have a great Thursday, and I hope you stay dry. Bye.